Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kristen Hopewell from the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC. I'd like to welcome you to our event today, which is hosted by the Center for Chinese Research and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the land on which UBC is situated and on which we're virtually meeting today is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica DiCarlo, who's a postdoctoral fellow and the Chevalier Junior Chair in Transportation and Development in China here in the Policy School. She'll be presenting exciting new research on China's overseas investments and the Belt and Road Initiative. The title of her talk today is Beyond Debt Trapping, Encompassing Accumulation, Infrastructure, and China's Spatiotemporal Fix. Following Dr. DiCarlo's talk, we're delighted to have two students from the Masters in Public Policy and Global Affairs program, Jemima Ogundele and Eddie Koreshniku, who will kick off the Q&A by posing some initial questions for Dr. DiCarlo, and then we'll open it up for a wider audience Q&A. So please feel free throughout the session to enter your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. Now, without further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. DiCarlo.
All right, can everyone see that? Yes, okay, great. I'm going to try my best to stick with 20 minutes here, but first, thanks very much, Kristen, for the introduction and organizing this talk. And I'd also like to thank the organizers at the Center for Chinese Studies and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, with special thanks to Jemima and Eddie for having this discussion with me. It's really an honor to present in this forum. So some background, I've been working on and doing research in and around the PRC since 2008, and much of what I'll share today on the Laos-China Railway comes from research between 2017 and 2020 in Laos. This talk, Beyond Debt Trapping, is my attempt to make sense of the ongoing and often heated debate around China as a predatory lender and suggest that more than debt trapping or even profit making, Chinese capital operates with additional logics of what Qin Li terms encompassing accumulation, and is able to do so because of the marketization of the Chinese state through state-owned enterprises and other mechanisms I'll talk about today. So to start, I'll give an overview of my project just so you have an idea of who I am, and then discuss rail financing, the notion of debt trapping, and then try to do three things. Think about how it's not intended to debt trap, suggest other logics of Chinese capital, and then focus on the role of state-owned enterprises or SOEs in this process. So zooming very far out, this is part of a broader dissertation project that I'm now working on as a book, as a postdoc at UBC, where I really try to illuminate the China side and Laos side of a few infrastructure projects in one corridor. I look at displacement of villagers on the ground, experiences of Chinese laborers, as well as Lao land governance and logics of Chinese capital. So this is where this work is coming from today. My research is centered on one infrastructural corridor in northern Laos and three interrelated projects that have become sort of emblematic of the Belt and Road Initiative: the railway, the economic corridor that's been built around it, and Boten's Special Economic Zone. My methodological approach as a geographer was ethnographic and relied on immersive fieldwork, as I said, between 2017 and 2020, when I studied across multiple field sites, really trying to think of them as nodes of connection along the railway and understand a diversity of perspectives across northern Laos, from kind of the population centers where decisions on policy and finance are made, to areas where villages in northern Laos where construction boomed and local lives were reshaped. So today I'm focusing specifically on the railway, and this runs from the border with China through northern Laos to the capital of Vientiane. This rail traverses some of the country's most populated, biodiverse, and resource-rich regions. And due to the mountainous terrain of northern Laos, the cost of this phenomenal engineering feat was $5.9 billion US. As a shareholder, the government of Laos is covering part of its committed funding with a loan from the Export-Import Bank of China. And the sustainability of that has been questioned. And overall, the project has attracted intense scrutiny from observers around the world due to this cost and has been cited as an example of predatory lending. To begin, a key aim of my research is to offer more grounded views and analyses on such stories that are often told from faraway perspectives. So I'll begin with a vignette in Northern Laos that set me on the path to actually examining railway capital and finance. Hong grew up in a village in Northern Laos. It wasn't far from the border with China, where he had the opportunity to attend school and learn Chinese. After returning to Laos from college, he was quickly able to land multiple jobs as a translator. Many were for construction companies. His current job placed him at the center of what was cited as a controversial and opaque Chinese Belt and Road project. On a summer afternoon in Udomsai province, we sat under the beating sun at a railway work site. I was not the only one sitting. In fact, I don't recall a single person working. It was not a protest per se, but the workers had gone yet another week where pay had been expected and none came. Most of the workers I talked with were Chinese and understood that they would eventually receive reimbursement in the coming months. Hong too had gone 3 months without pay. Their experiences had surprised me because I had just left a number of Lao villages that had been fighting for land compensation for land that was used for construction. They lost homes and farmland, and many people lamented they had no information on the project. The Chinese worker and Lao experiences repeatedly point back to a lack of capital as they speculated for the variety of reasons why they hadn't been paid, citing that the government didn't have compensation money, Chinese banks were delayed in fronting loans, or SOEs were keeping the money for themselves. So on the ground, the delay of capital for construction was really a quiet undercurrent that was kept from broader public view. Meanwhile, debt trapping rhetoric raged publicly, regionally, and internationally. So rather than follow the money, these experiences prompted me to pursue spaces where the money did not show up as intended, and yet somehow construction was able to plow ahead. I won't spend too much time on this, but conceptually, I draw on C.K. Lee's formulation of global China, which is kind of her shorthand for China's economic expansion and stabilizing strategy, not as kind of a singular entity, but a phenomenon, and I'll talk more about that. And then from there, I looked to her premise of Chinese state capital as distinctly different from global private capital. And that offers, I found a useful entry point to consider the logics behind the railroad. And I build on her notion of encompassing accumulation by thinking about debt as a temporal fix. But I won't go too much into the theoretical part. So to begin, railways often don't generate significant revenue, nor enough capital to repay project debts through the function of the infrastructure alone. Thus, private companies often deem them unsuitable for investment. For that reason, the history of railroad construction around the world is often tied to the invention of banking systems or finance mechanisms. For example, Credit Suisse was founded in 1856 for the sole purpose of financing railway construction. From the early 19th century to today, many existing high-speed and standard rail projects rarely operate profitably, even in wealthy or densely populated regions. And with the boom in China's international rail construction, it's become hotly debated whether BRI lines will ever reach financial return on investment for any party involved. The Laos-China Railway is no different. According to multilateral development banks, as well as the project's feasibility study, the rail will not generate enough profit to pay for its construction, operation, or management for years to come. The feasibility actually claims that we'll recover from accrual losses starting in 2038, which is 17 years of operation in. And the World Bank actually cited that as optimistic and estimated that there would be losses between $590 million to nearly $4.4 billion in the first 25 years of operation. In one World Bank scenario, the joint venture could potentially repay loans by the 25th year of operation. In another study that the Asian Development Bank did, where they created a scenario on passenger service, the Laos-China Railway would need to run 8.8 billion kilometers to break even. In other words, that's 87 round trips between Kunming, China and Vientiane per day, with trains carrying 650 passengers every day for decades. And in the meantime, the project will start just by losing 100 million per year. In reality, the project does run freight and passenger, but that just gives us a sense of kind of the scale of this issue. And of course, one thing I want to mention is profitability here is being thought of at a firm level or a project level. However, as an article in the Laos state-run newspaper noted, the railway is not just an investment for the purpose of making profit. Similarly, a Lao economist was explaining to me, we know that it's not going to be profitable and it's too expensive. It's about other things like export technology, regionalization, economic and political influence. And his statement touches on a number of points concerning the cost of the railway and resounding questions around debt. So to come back to this initial point, railways are not often profitable, and I argue that doesn't actually mean that they're intended to debt trap either. Given the lack of profitability, it's not surprising that the Laos-China Railway was an example of predatory lending. The high costs attracted scrutiny from observers around the world that cite it as an example of debt trap diplomacy, meaning that China uses loans to ensnare countries for political or ideological reasons. And this term was first introduced to describe a Sri Lankan port and it has since rippled through Western media, think tanks, and political offices. However, even as debt trapping has been invalidated by a number of scholars in many contexts, the loan for the railway continued to spark these debates even today. So although the railway is not going to be profitable, again, I don't think it will be a debt trap case. My intention here is also not to dispel the idea that capital itself is not predatory or entrapping in some ways. But what I do want to say is that geopolitical assumptions, namely that in the absence of clear revenue streams, projects must be designed to exploit other countries, just does not hold. To date, there's no evidence that China engages in predatory lending with the aim of imposing geopolitical conditions or strategic asset seizure. For example, Malik and al. At Aid Data analyzed over 10,000 Chinese loans and found that, quote, none of these lending practices are intrinsically harmful to developing countries. And as Deborah Brodingham put it, debt trap diplomacy is a meme which took deep root in Washington, D.C., ricocheted beyond Delhi and Japan, along the Beltway, and back to the New York Times. So I am just ahead of myself on slides, but these are two of the widely cited examples that some of these scholars worked on, the Hementota port in Sri Lanka and the Praiseport in Greece. And the mainstream narrative is that these ports' inability to pay loans led to the seizure of their assets. However, decisions to privatize both ports was made by their respective governments to reduce high sovereign debt ratios. And this doesn't include debt just from China, but also in Sri Lanka's case, debt that spanned 2 decades. The Laos-China Railway shares many similarities in this case, an infrastructure built ahead of demand and operating under significant losses. The existing political economy of the country is not necessarily equipped to handle those losses. And there are outstanding debts from decades before that aren't related to the debt trap project. And this isn't to say that debt is not an issue in Laos. It is a serious issue. Laos currently has a high level of sovereign and public debt, which indeed requires close attention. And like Sri Lanka, debt in Laos is accumulated from multiple sources. The country has a long history of development finance through ADB loans, World Bank loans, and other bilateral partners. But at this point, the Lao government's total railway debt payment for this year will be about 10% of the total public debt payment. So not insignificant, but not necessarily trapping at this point. So to hone in on the railway itself, I just wanted to look at the specific joint venture and finance arrangements. So the Laos-China Railway joint venture is a Sino-Lao joint venture set up in Vientiane specifically for this project. And it's responsible for the construction, operation, and management of the railway. The Lao side holds 30% share, while the Chinese side holds 70% share and is made up of a number of state-owned enterprises that are headed by the China State Railway Group. The structure reflects a shift in Chinese financing towards PPPs or public-private partnerships, and also points to an increased focus on risk sharing across multiple sources of capital and across the SOEs. The joint venture is also known as a special purpose vehicle or an SPV. And this sort of PPP, I'm sorry for all the acronyms, is a subsidiary company and a standalone legal entity formed to undertake specific projects and mitigate any risks there to it. So it distances both the Lao government and the SOEs from risk, supposedly. And if we look at the numbers, railway financing arrangements demonstrate that China is not necessarily concerned with debt trapping or even profit at this point. The green boxes represent the Lao capital and yellow are Chinese. And for the $5.95 billion project, the joint venture through the SPV borrowed 60% of the investment cost from China Exim Bank, while the remaining 40% was provided as equity from Lao and Chinese enterprises. In contrast, many Chinese debt trap reports actually claim that the Lao government was paying the $6 billion price tag, which would be 1/3 of the country's GDP. However, in reality, they're paying about 12% of the total project cost. And this is in comparison to Chinese sources, which are providing 1.66 billion upfront in capital and are also committed to raising an additional 3.57 billion through Chinese banks. So in other words, SOEs are responsible for about 28% of the total project cost. And this has been split to share between several companies, as I said, within this special purpose vehicle. And it's important to keep in mind that the railway remains one of many projects for which the Laos state is responsible, again, for 12% of the project cost as their equity investment of $730 million. And you'll see here is kind of a funny thing, but due to Laos' low fiscal capacity, the authorities arranged a separate $480 million Exim Bank loan to cover 2/3 of their equity. So their equity is actually partially debt financed. The remaining $250 million was meant to come from the Laos state budget, and this commitment had to be made before loans were dispersed. And this is something I'll get back to later that ended up affecting land compensation and worker compensation. And finally, the remaining 60% is through the joint venture. And there's contingent liability of 18% for the Lao government, though the joint venture claims that neither the government or the SOEs would be liable for that at this point. So to return to yet another meme that does not quite capture the complexity of the situation, I want to problematize terms like trap and hidden, which really imply underhanded and manipulative motives, and suggest that these terms portray China quite inaccurately as very monolithic, centralized, coordinated, and more coordinated than it really is. Furthermore, they're discounting the host country actors involved in project negotiations and how other Chinese actors have been exploited in this process. And finally, they mistakenly rely on calculus of profit maximization. Rather than profit maximization, in the context of Chinese overseas railway investment, operating losses are often accepted as long as they're less than the costs of letting projects sit idle. One thing Cronin, who was writing about the transcontinentals in North America, pointed out that even then there was a specific logic of capital, and that was to make Chicago the greatest railroad center of the world. So some of these readings have led me to question, how does the railway fit with logics of Chinese state capital for infrastructure? So the second thing I want to talk about, and one answer I have for that, has to do with infrastructure as a spatial fix. Infrastructure building requires vast amount of capital, including finance, labor, and commodities. And the capital intensive nature of projects like the railway takes surplus capital in circulation and fixes it in infrastructure for future returns. And this helps China maintain domestic economic growth as well as social stability in the near term. In addition, it protects state institutions from devaluation as projects like the railway absorb this surplus capital within China that would potentially have been devalued due to lack of investment outlets within China. So what I want to highlight here is a lot of people have been writing about the spatial fix for a long time, and I want to focus on the temporal dimension of the fix as a potentially underexplored and crucial logic of Chinese state capital. More than just expanding across space, railways facilitate an expansion of capital into the future. As such, the railway and BRI infrastructure offer an opportunity for China to address chronic issues of domestic overaccumulation at home by building overseas. As such, capital embraces unproductive and unprofitable activities because it begets more capital through speculation and debt. So rather than, again, debt trapping or short-term profit maximization, debt becomes an outlet for overaccumulated capital. And I won't go too much more into this. The takeaway is that in addition to fixing capital in place, financial investments in infrastructure have become sophisticated outlets, especially after the 2008 crisis, to temporally fix capital in large projects outside of China's borders. Doing on time. Okay. And finally, delay, whether it's in the immediate term with people not being paid, or deferral in the longer term in terms of debt as an outlet for overaccumulation, is made possible through the involvement of state-owned enterprises and the use of PPPs and joint ventures. Chinese railway capital is characterized by state-owned enterprises that both have the capacity to lend huge amounts of capital and withstand and even benefit from long waiting periods on investment returns. And this, I suggest, is because SOEs have political and economic support, which affords them much more tolerance for risk, as well as power to offload it. So I don't know if that actually is showing up on my screen, but SOEs are engaged in both financing and construction of the railway and act, as Emily Ye has put it, as part and parcel of the marketization of the Chinese state. So through SOE motivations to engage in construction, although they may originate in Beijing and are connected to wider visions of a Chinese dream or the Belt and Road, they still have commercial interests and face barriers on the ground, such as labor and capital shortages, local protests, or local corruption. In other words, SOEs are not wholly under the control of a central state or grand strategy, but they also do not solely pursue profit motives. So finally, I want to bring us back to the story of Hong and the other workers who were waiting to get paid and why they didn't get paid on time. First, kind of back to the theory of all this, labor is required to transfer surplus capital of finance and commodities into fixed capital, the infrastructure itself. So laborers are a key part of this. And without going into too much detail, one of the loan conditions for the Exim Bank loans to come through was that the Lao government would provide upfront their $250 million US, and then the Exim Bank would release the remaining money for the project. The condition was instituted by the bank to mitigate risk for Chinese investors, but it became a major roadblock to the project's funding. And due to the capital limitations of the Lao government, the Ministry of Finance ended up renegotiating the terms of capital input for equity and arranging it so they would put in $50 million US per year for 5 years of construction. As a result, construction ended up proceeding and was pushed through with China's speed, as I was told, while both land compensation payments and laborers' wages were delayed for months, if not years. This resulted in a sort of trap, I would suggest, not a geopolitical one, but one where lower level contractors were trapped into putting up their own capital to keep construction running. Capital delay first severely affected the SOEs and then subcontractors who ended up using their own resources to maintain project construction. And in turn, joint ventures and SOEs placed a significant financial burden on lower level actors. Others had to keep working and expect to be paid in the future. And as one worker explained, I haven't been paid in months. It's not so bad for me because in China, we're used to waiting a few months or till the end of the year or a project to be paid, but Lao people quit because they cannot wait. So I've tried to kind of take you through some different scales of the effects of capital with this project. And to conclude, I'll bring it back to the debt trap narrative and suggest that it really fails to capture a number of these critical dynamics. First, where other traps may exist, particularly those not at the national scale. Second, it doesn't account for the changing role of SOEs, which have been the driving force in China's global economic expansion, and really able to uniquely pursue profits in politics, build local relationships. Third, it overlooks both Laos's broader debt relations and longer history of debt and local political economy. And it also overlooks China's domestic political economy. On the China side, projects are motivated not only as BRI poster projects, but as a means for dealing with domestic overaccumulation. And finally, though this was less of a focus here, it underestimates the appeal of Chinese infrastructure and state capitalism amongst the Lao political elite as forces that align with domestic development objectives. So to connect it back to the literature I started with, far from a coherent strategy, Chinese state capital is driven at times by contradictory forms of the state, corporate, and personal interests. And more than a logic of profit maximization, Chinese state capital is temporally fixed through the often uncoordinated actions of state and commercial entities. So I will end there, and thank you so much for listening to this talk.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. You've done a wonderful job of taking this very large scale macro structural thing, Chinese overseas investment, the BRI, and drilling down and giving us this very rich, detailed analysis of what this actually looks like on the ground and what the dynamics are involved. What we'll do now is turn it over to our two MPBGA students, Eddie and Jemima, to each pose a couple of questions to Jessica to kick off our broader discussion. So I'll turn it to Eddie first.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Hopewell, and thank you, Dr. DiCarlo. That was really fascinating. I particularly enjoyed the breakdown of how the ownership of the project was put together. I think sometimes we read about most of this and do not know the details and at what percentage the Laos government actually participated in and how that impacts their own fiscal position. So thank you so much for that. It was very interesting. I guess I'll ask a couple of questions at the same time just to make it a bit easier. So as I went through thinking about the presentation, also your paper, one thing that I kept considering was how do Western nations that invest in infrastructure in developing countries or in development money in developing countries, how do they differ from China's banks? So one aspect of that is China's banks, as part of the state-owned enterprises, do seem to take collateral that seems to be different from Western nations. If you can expand a little bit on that and if there's any real impact there between the difference of financing. And I suppose the second one would be, has the BRIs, the Belt and Road Initiatives, changed since its initiation in 2013? How does technology and environment and all these other pieces play a role in it? Thanks again.
Great, thanks, Eddie. And we'll turn it over to Jemima. And just to remind our audience members, please feel free to enter your own questions in the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll turn to those in a minute. On to Jemima.
Thank you, Dr. Well, it was a very great presentation, Dr. DiCarlo. And also reading your paper, I came up with these two questions. Is Chinese capitalism a different kind of capitalism as, opposed to the Western capitalism? And the phenomenon of global China is about China seeking spatial and political fixes to its resource and profit bottleneck in the context of a national and global overaccumulation crisis with no preordained or guaranteed outcome. So how is this different from the way the West operates? So those are the two questions that I have for you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jemima. We'll turn it over to Jessica to respond.
Thanks very much for these questions. I think I have my work cut out for me. They're fantastic ones that many of them I've been thinking about for a long time and working on answering. So I guess I will start with this question of kind of what is, in terms of development finance, what is different between the West and China? And I guess I want to take a step back first and think about what is development spending and development finance. I think it's, you have these traditional donors such as the World Bank, ADB, IMF, and that looks a very particular way with lending for certain projects. And Chinese development does have kind of these ODA, official development assistance-like flows, but Chinese spending and loans tend toward more bilateral lending and interaction than Western, kind of traditional Western development models. So I just want to think about that as a very separate thing and use that to set the stage. And then in terms of Chinese practices, I'd say one of the first, I think what we hear of as one of the biggest differences is the idea of conditionalities versus deference. So Western loans coming with governance conditionalities, whereas Chinese projects really defer to the host state. So unlike kind of the post-World War II Bretton Woods institutions, Chinese actors don't typically pursue extension of their own laws or rules or policies in a country that it lends to. And instead, BRI projects and Chinese projects in general are pitched as alternatives to the conditionalities of traditional lenders. So again, there's kind of this preference for bilateral relations with a development partner, which can be quite different. And although these projects are kind of pitched as benign or win-win or no strings attached, this in some ways could be true without imposing certain laws, but it also is part of a selling strategy of these projects. There are somewhat visible strings that loans come with. And I would say they often, in contrast to the governance conditions of Western loans, there are really more commercial conditions. For example, tending to use Chinese firms, which means sometimes host partners benefit less. The idea that security and military aspects are becoming more important, where construction sites are often requiring protection. So I've heard of that in a number of locations. The loan condition for the railway is another commercial condition that was meant to safeguard Chinese companies. And then it can also come with political strings to an extent, kind of the recognition of territorial claims or kind of just bolstering bilateral relationships. So I think in terms of conditions, neither are without them. So yeah, they just differ quite a bit. And then I also want to add that understanding China as a development actor is really, it entails pulling apart China quite a bit. As I was saying, it's not about this unidirectional focus or China as a monolith, but there are many versions of kind of the China model of development. China is on one hand relying on state-owned enterprises, but they're also relying on private sector firms. For example, Huawei has expanded China's development influence at a global scale. And these firms tend to really operate more with their own agendas, more so than kind of a centralized state agenda. So I think pulling apart development and investment is a real tricky thing to do in the China case. And let's see, I'd say I want to end with one more thing. In terms of Chinese development, what I've noticed is that it seems like local actors or host states are able to potentially shape, challenge, or redirect development in unexpected ways. I think Western development processes really try to engage in dialogue before a process, and that happens differently, at least where I've done work in Laos and Nepal. I've seen that happen quite differently, where pushback ends up changing something instead of having dialogue before. So I think, yeah, the ability of host countries to leverage certain Chinese development projects is something that people are starting to talk about. And I am just rambling at this point, but let's see what the next question is. That's a great question. I think, let's see, the second one was, how has the BRI changed since its inception? And then I think there was another part to that. I guess how I want to respond to that, I mean, you can kind of start with the 5 BRI areas as a framework for the BRIs about people-to-people connection and bilateral relationships and policy coordination, finance coordination, and they're kind of broad brushstroke areas of what the BRI is. I really like something that one of my advisors wrote about this, Tim Oakes. He called the BRI an invitation to fill in a blank space, saying that we all love the idea of being able to fill in this blank space. So the BRI is actually really a vague thing or just an idea, and it invites others to write onto it what they will, whether that is, the Lao state or, for example, local NGOs who have started to engage with BRI aid money. So I like this idea of thinking about the BRI as a blank space that is really drawing people in instead of forcing certain agendas on. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but that, and then I think the tech digital side, and then the greening the BRI literature that's coming out and work that's coming out is something that has evolved because of all the projects on the ground. And I think I will leave it there. I don't want to talk too long. I want to leave question and answer time. But then let's see, the next question I had was on the difference between Chinese and Western capitalism. And I think for this, I want to look to C.K. Lee. So I was talking about her book, which of course I have on my desk, because why not? The Specter of Global China. And I use this quite a bit in this chapter to think about how I want to think about Chinese capital and Chinese capitalism. And it's a question that scholars have grappled with for quite some time. So I really like to lean on her framework. She broadly, she has rejected this more widely used framework of varieties of capitalism, saying that they really fail to recognize the primary role of local politics in the recipient companies and what she describes as an eventful nature of capitalism, so a moment instead of a set system. So in the book, she proposes this idea of varieties of capital as a more appropriate framework to understand kind of the opportunities and challenges around these projects and China's going out. So she examines two varieties of capital, Chinese state capital as opposed to global private capital through the copper and construction industries in Zambia. And she argues that they follow different patterns of three things: accumulation, production, and ethos of management. So global private capital is really motivated by a logic of profit maximization. And she says that that might be a part of Chinese state capital's logic, but it's also about things such as sustainable production and a particular ethos of management around eating bitterness. And in terms of production, she says it prioritizes the longer term, while the global private capital prioritizes the shorter term. So I don't think I'm going to have a good answer in terms of different capitalisms, but I think thinking about how capital operates differently, this kind of varieties of capital has been helpful in my work. And then let's see, I think it was a spatial fix question. And I would love to pause on that and possibly come back to it and just turn over to the audience Q&A.
Right, we actually have a large and growing number of questions from the audience. So yeah, the first two questions are from Irene Pang, who thanks you for a great presentation. And she asks, first, in what currency are the loans/project payments denominated? China's ability to wean its chronic dependence on buying US Treasury bonds has been heavily limited by the global mobility or the lack thereof of its currency. To what extent are infrastructural projects abroad an attempt to internationalize the Chinese currency or find an outlet for its excess US dollar holdings? And her second question is, you pointed out that the delays in payments to subcontractors, workers, et cetera, functions effectively as a form of financing from below. Subcontractors use their own resources to finance portions of the construction project. She says we see this not only in Chinese construction projects abroad, but also very widely in construction projects within China as well. To what extent is this temporal fix related to the logic of encompassing accumulation?
These are fantastic questions, and they're honestly going to be very helpful in my thinking moving forward. So thank you for them. Yeah, so the currencies are denominated in US dollars. And what's interesting, what this question makes me think of is not sure if you've heard of the kind of Shanghai model that was proposed in 2001 as a means of possibly restructuring Chinese debt overseas. And part of that process would entail, the restructuring would entail using renminbi instead of US dollars to buy bonds. I we'll have to go back to this, but this is what your question has made me think of in the restructuring process. And I think that, yeah, I mean, to your point, at kind of the finance level, there's this attempt to internationalize Chinese currency. And it also at the project level, interestingly, because the Lao Kip has been depreciating recently, the project joint venture asked the Lao government to start taking payment in renminbi instead of Lao Kip so that they have a more stable currency, which is a bit outside your question, but it was an interesting turn of events this year. The railway started running in December 2021, so they're kind of just working out all the challenges around it, and with the currency devaluing, that has been a big issue for repaying loans. And then let's see, from below, to what extent is a temporal fix related to encompassing accumulation? Yeah, so I think that's, I'm working on this as a paper right now, and that's really what I'm trying to sort out myself. I want to add to this idea of encompassing accumulation a temporal perspective, instead of just saying it's about resource access or profit optimization, as Lee puts it. I think it's really another logic that I'm trying to add to that debate. I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great. Our next set of questions are from Ramana. He also thanks you for a very interesting talk and has a number of questions, but says he'll stick with just 3 here. First, as someone not working in this area, I would have assumed that by now the idea that China is interested in debt trapping would be dismissed as ridiculous. Is it really necessary to keep disproving this anymore? If so, who is making the argument about China being involved in debt trapping and why? Second, I'd like to learn more about who within Laos is benefiting or profiting from this project. You mentioned Lao political elites. Who are these elites and what is their agenda? And third, you had a very intriguing quote from someone called Mitchell 2020 about capital wanting delay. Is this Timothy Mitchell? More importantly, why does capital want delay? And he says he realizes these are big questions, of course, and we'd be happy to engage offline as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this more offline. Definitely. I have been, your first question, working through a very similar question myself. You know, are we still talking about debt trapping? I think we all understand, I say we all, what has been written about this. And I was just continually shocked at how many times I heard from people in Laos, whether they were working in banks or government offices or NGOs. It was just such a common narrative that it felt like it's still worthy to, at least in the Lao context, write about and say very clearly that, you know, this is actually not a case of debt trapping. It is still one of the questions that it's circulating around all our Lao listservs, and it's really kind of remarkable. I agree with you. It doesn't feel necessary from my academic position, but in terms of kind of the NGO, you know, every day, it just seemed like something that still needed to be talked about. And then who's benefiting? Yes, this has been the ultimate question. So at this point, I think I want to answer this well and fairly. The joint venture has really tightly managed this. So in terms of elites benefiting in ways that I've seen them benefit from other projects like hydropower or special economic zones where there are certain payoffs, et cetera, I haven't heard of that as much for the railway. But in terms of Laos having a rail through the country, people in Laos are really excited about it. They're excited to be able to get to the capital more quickly. There is, yeah, I think socially, it just seemed like a very positive response, at least from the people in villages that I was in and interviewed. In terms of trade, for example, at this point, it's again been running for a couple months, and the real benefit on the trade side of things seems to be to on the China side, because freight lines have been coming down quite full of Chinese goods to Laos to be transported to Thailand. But in terms of goods going back, I've heard, and I would have to check on this, but I've heard that a lot of the freight cars or trains are not going back full. So at this point, some friends, folks in government are really scrambling to figure out how Lao people can produce more to engage in this increased cross-border trade. So I think, to kind of summarize that, how does Lao benefit has been a really central question whenever I talk about this research. And I think the government is still really working on what that'll look like at kind of a national or regional scale. This railroad got built quite quickly after years of thinking it would never get done. It was proposed in the 1990s by ASEAN, and yeah, it was a project that didn't seem like it was ever going to get built, and then all of a sudden in 5 years it was. And I think the government's still really working on how to make this corridor profitable for the country. And yes, to answer your third question, that is Timothy Mitchell. And so, yeah, to answer that really briefly, and then I'd love to maybe get a coffee and talk about it. He argues that we need to think about infrastructure as introducing delay so that you're able to delay I'm saying you're able to delay the devaluation of profits. This came from a short piece he wrote on infrastructure. Oh, what was his key argument? He was essentially saying that it's about if you sink money into an infrastructure project, it'll end up appreciating over time. And that is why the logic of capital would want that delay. And I will come back to that with you one-on-one, I hope. Sorry, that was not the most eloquent answer.
All right, turning to our next question. This is from Tim Cheek. It's just from my screen here. He asks, given the multiple actors in a Chinese-sponsored development project, what are the policy options for those wishing to address environmental or gender issues? That is, if there's no one secret boss to wrestle with.
Yeah, that is a really, really great question. And it's a question that it's so different based on the country that you're working in. Laos is not going to be Thailand. It will not be Nepal. So the policy options for environmental issues, I'm sure many of you here know that there's a process of deference and just deferring to host country policies in terms of environmental and social safeguards. So what that looks like in the Lao context is that there are all of these policies written. A challenge with the railway, and this is something I've been working on separately, is that because it was rushed through quite quickly, a lot of the safeguard processes were just overlooked. So the monitoring hasn't been done. The land compensation issues have been some of the key problems around the project. The way it works in the Lao context is, if a project is of significance, then whatever ministry is overseeing that will likely tell the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resources that this is a project we want to fast track through all of those processes, which sounds quite bleak, but that has been, when they're kind of big priority projects, there aren't very good on the ground mechanisms to safeguard environmental and social issues. And I wish I had something different to report on that. Yeah, so I think sometimes there is a secret boss to wrestle with.
All right, our next question is from Elsie Lewison, and she asks, I'm curious what discourses of sovereign debt, if any, you might have encountered in Laos, for example, among officials, workers, residents.
Yeah, let's see. So, yeah, it is. So the debt issues in Laos, since I started my fieldwork until today, it started as kind of the railway is potentially debt trapping and all of that. But what actually ended up happening throughout my fieldwork is that the hydropower sector really became the focus of public debt issues. So there's a lot of overspending in hydropower, transmission lines, et cetera. And because of the government debt, it was in, I want to say it was 2019 or 20, Laos state grid, Electricity du Lao, was actually partially, taken over by the China Southern Grid to help with the debt issues in the electricity sector. So the China Southern Grid now has a 49% stake in Electricity du Lao. And most of what I heard from people around sovereign debt issues really circulated around that problem. And of course, it doesn't help that it is a Chinese company engaged in that process. And who also has quite a stake in the electricity sector because so many of the dams on and off the Mekong are Chinese funded. So part of the reason China Southern Grid became involved in this was because of their huge investment in the Namu hydropower cascade. So yes, I think that was kind of the main focus in terms of public debt and sovereign debt and kind of fears around giving away parts of the country or the country's assets.
Great. Our next question is from Prashant Rayaprolu. He asks, some accounts of Chinese capitalism have suggested that the party is taking greater control over SOEs in the private sector. Has this changed the practice of SOEs internationalization? And did you observe any changes in Laos?
Yeah, really, really great question. Thank you for that. So I guess I will say I didn't observe that in Laos directly. It's also not very easy to get interviews with the SOEs directly when they're there working on projects or people that would be able to comment on this sort of question. But I think it makes me think about the kind of provincial SOEs and the mandates and goals that they have versus kind of more centralized SOEs. And I think that potentially in terms of having greater control over some, yes, emanating from Beijing, that would make sense to me. But in terms of kind of smaller SOEs or subcontractors working on the railway, that is not something I really saw in the Lao context. It almost felt like there were some that were kind of front and center, and then others that flew under the radar and reported to those more centralized SOEs. But that, I really appreciate that question. I'll definitely be giving it more thought.
I think I'll take advantage of my position as chair to pose a question to you as well. One thing that seems extraordinary is you mentioned that this project was really rushed through extremely quickly to such an extent that there wasn't a real cost benefit analysis done. This is still an extremely costly project. You said, I think, 10% of the national budget annually is going to finance this. Given that Laos has a number of other development priorities, if there wasn't a clear sense in the government about how this was connected to larger development objectives, why was this process so hasty? Why was this so rushed? Why wasn't there a more considered evaluation of the potential benefits and costs of this type of an endeavor?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think part of it was rushed because it was so connected to larger development objectives of the Lao state. This idea of the kind of classic line has been Laos needs to transform from landlocked to land-linked. And that's been at the center of national socioeconomic development plans since the early 2000s. So yeah, the railway has been this almost unachievable project because it is so expensive. And there was assumption that, once it was a land-linked country, Laos would be able to engage in so many other economic development activities and trade, et cetera. So I think part of it was, it's interesting. The process took quite a long time. And then when construction started, it felt like it went lightning fast. the Lao government actually was the one who sought out funding for this project and went to Japanese actors first, who decided not to pursue it, and then was able to secure Chinese funding in early 2010. But there were a number of issues within the Lao Ministry of Railways that ended up delaying the project. So it kind of had this long life before it even got to the feasibility study stage. Yeah, and I think there was a push, like once it was starting to happen, I've heard from friends in various ministries that they just had to make it happen as fast as possible because they had been waiting so long for it, and because they now had China backing it. And again, that idea of China's speed when it comes to infrastructure construction, it was a lot of just pushing everything through. So again, I think it is quite connected to Laos's larger development visions. Yeah, and then why are these things rushed? I mean, there is a feasibility study, there is an environmental impact assessment, and then it's really about the monitoring for that process. Or yeah, there's a whole other story around kind of land compensation and appropriation for the project that was quite difficult. As this project was being rushed, there was no real plan for land appropriation, and the money for that wasn't ready either. So it felt quite ad hoc in the process as it was happening when I was doing my field work. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Great. Well, I think we're at the end of our time, but I want to thank Dr. DiCarlo for a fascinating presentation. Also our two discussants, Jemima and Eddie, for some fantastic questions, and our audience members as well. Thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon.